The Black Summer had a huge impact. The fires were unprecedented. We saw a whole lot of the east coast of Australia on fire. I'm just wondering, can you help us understand what was the actual impact from a biodiversity and from a species perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I'll start with that one. And first of all, I'll note that the fires had devastating impacts on people and communities, and we should acknowledge that. We're not talking about that in particular here. We're talking about the environmental impacts. And the other point I'd make as a prefatory remark would be that these fires, the 2019-20 fires, had extraordinary, unprecedented consequences for biodiversity, but they've got to be seen in the context. And one of those contexts is that they're a forewarning of a dystopian future if we do things the way that we're doing things at the moment. And that's a stark reminder. It's a warning of a future that none of us really want. So we have to do things differently. I guess in measuring the impact, assessing the impact, we've also got to acknowledge that many of Australia's species and environments were declining anyway before these fires due to a whole range of other factors, threats. And the fires have had a compounding impact on those declines anyway. So that it wasn't as if we were looking at a purely pristine system that the fires had a solitary impact upon. They've got to be seen in the context of a whole range of factors that have forcing the decline of Australian species anyway. So these fires were unprecedented since European occupation of Australia. So they burnt 20% of the Australian eucalypt forests, whereas a normal year, maybe 2% is burnt. So they were huge magnitude, really extensive. They went over for a really long period from August 2019 to March 2020, which is much longer than the normal fire season. And they burnt at severity, which is largely unprecedented. So far more of the fires burnt at really high severity than is normal in Australian bushfire seasons. And that meant that there were very few unburnt patches left that typically provide refuge and sort of shelter for many of these species that are exposed to fires. So we know that about some of the impacts, for example, are that we know that about a quarter to a third of Australian threatened species had some of their range burnt in these fires. We know that about the same number of threatened species that we formerly thought were safe are now, because of these fires, eligible to be listed as threatened. So the fires have not only affected many threatened species, but they've also affected many species that we thought were safe. So we know that many of the species and environments that were affected by these fires are species that are really old lineages that have been in this country for millions and millions of years, and that normally are not used to fire. They're really ill adapted to fire. So they've got very slow reproductive rates. They live a long time. They've got really specialized habitat and resource requirements. So we're losing not only randomly species, but also species that are really distinctive parts of the old Australia. And they're just simply not used to the heartbeat of the pulse that's apparent that these fires.
We're losing a lot, John.
Sorry, okay. I'll pass on to Libby.
I think, we talk about species, but also we can think about the effects on ecological communities. And so, there are really fire-sensitive communities that were burnt in these fires. We look at some of the impacts on our rainforests and on our peatland and bog communities. And we know through some of the research from NESP that some of these communities were substantially impacted. And also, again, just drawing on that point of John's, the impacts of cumulative threats acting on these communities. So, we had severe drought leading up to these fires, and so so we could. It's not unexpected, really, that some of the impacts were so great.
And if I may, we think based on sort of knowledge of responses to previous fires that it will take many years for many of these species to recover to their pre-fire populations. And the assessments from our experts who have most informed about the conservation and ecology of these species is that none of the really fire-affected species will recover to their pre-fire populations within 10 years or so. And that's just on the assumption that there'll be no future similar fires over that period. So recovery is going to be a real problem for many of these species. The impacts are really long lasting. And the most extreme of those long lasting events, consequences of these fires, is extinction. And there's good evidence that we've lost at least one species because of these fires. It's become extinct. And it's probably highly likely that many of the poorly known species, the invertebrates, of which about 1,000 invertebrate species had lost about 50% or more of their range in these fires. Many of those species are also probably extinct. We simply don't know at the moment.
I think the other thing, just to add, particularly to what Libby was saying about the ecosystem-wide impacts, is that we're seeing now the effects of interacting threats on a scale that we haven't seen before. So myrtle rust is a threat that's lain dormant in a lot of the East Coast rainforest systems for some time. It's not completely dormant, and it has had an impact on particular species, a profound impact on certain species. But what we're seeing now in the wake of the fires is that it's had by sitting in the system when the fires come through, that myrtle rust attacks the regrowth more strongly than it does the older and mature trees. So what we're seeing is that the attempts that these systems are making to regrow, and many of the canopy species and many of the critical species in rainforest systems are unable to regrow and to recruit new trees, or they start to grow and then myrtle rust takes a hold and they die, and then they start to grow, and eventually you get tree death even of these older trees. So what that's doing is actually removing whole keystone species from systems, and particularly in, for example, in rainforest systems, we're seeing that that regrowth is probably not going to happen, and so you've actually lost a whole patch of what in some cases is World Heritage Area rainforest or wetlands.
And Rachel's point,
Thank
if I may, sorry, Heather, just if I can amplify Rachel's point just a little. The fire burnt many of the really important natural icons in Australia. So many World Heritage Areas, many Ramsar wetlands of international importance, many threatened species, many places that we thought were safe, refugial areas that where species, the sort of cornerstones of conservation in Australia were affected by these fires. Much more so than is normally the case.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, Libby, and Rachel, for sharing that. It's extremely sobering to hear that and to understand that it wasn't just the fires, it was the extent of them, the ferocity, where they were, but also then the increase of the threats post the fires. So that compounding effect. So thank you very much for sharing those insights. And of course, there will be links where people can actually find a lot of the detailed information.